Gang, you think we can talk Billy into doing nothing from nothing for us?
They called him the fifth Beatle, but history left him behind. He played with the greatest, won Grammys, topped the charts, yet his name is rarely mentioned. How does a man so brilliant, so essential, become just a footnote in music history? This is Celebrity Underrated, the Billy Preston story. The rise, the fall, and the truth behind a legend they tried to forget. Billy Preston's journey is not just the tale of a gifted musician, it is the story of a prodigy whose sound carried gospel fire into rock and funk, who lifted up the world's biggest band in their darkest hour, and who still ended up overlooked. His music was everywhere, his fingerprints on some of the most iconic recordings of the 20th century. But while others were immortalized, Preston's light was dimmed, hidden in the shadows of the stars he supported. He was more than a sideman, more than a session player. He was a bridge between gospel and rock, between funk and faith, between joy and pain. His organ swells and electric grooves could heal, ignite, and transform. When he played, the atmosphere shifted. Yet, despite being at the center of history, he was too often left on the margins. Why do we remember the legends he helped save, but not the man who made their music soar? Why do we celebrate the spotlight while forgetting the heartbeat that powered it? Billy Preston's life forces us to ask, what happens when genius is undeniable, but recognition is denied? Billy Preston was born on the 2nd of September 1946 in Houston, Texas, into a world already steeped in rhythm and gospel. His mother, Robbie Preston Williams, was herself a singer and church musician, and from the very beginning she noticed something unusual about her son. For most toddlers, music was noise, just banging on pots, humming along to familiar tunes. But for Billy, music was language, an instinct that appeared before words could even form. When the Preston family relocated to Los Angeles, the move opened the door to the city's vibrant church scene. In this community, the organ wasn't just an instrument, it was a force, the thunder and heartbeat of worship. And Billy, still only 3 years old, was already drawn to it with unshakable focus. His hands were tiny, barely able to stretch across the keys of the Hammond organ. Yet somehow, impossibly, he wasn't just pressing notes, he was creating chords, progressions, melodies. Neighbors, churchgoers, and musicians would gather to watch this little boy perched on a bench far too big for him, his legs dangling, but his fingers moving with uncanny assurance. What they saw was more than talent. It felt like destiny. Word spread quickly. By the time Billy was 10, he was already performing on national television. This was no small feat in the 1,950 seconds, especially for a black child from a modest background. Audiences were stunned not just by his command of the keys, but by his stage presence. He carried himself with joy, with an infectious energy that could light up even the most hardened crowd. But while others saw brilliance, Billy was experiencing something different. He was still a child, yet already living under adult expectations. Applause echoed in his ears. But behind it was the growing realization that this was no hobby, this was work, and he was the breadwinner before he even reached high school. Sleepovers, schoolyard games, carefree afternoons, all those rituals of childhood slipped through his fingers as quickly as his notes rolled across the keys. By age 11, he was backing some of the greatest voices in gospel. The legendary Mahalia Jackson brought him onto her stage, praising him as a gift from God. To stand beside her, to play while her voice soared through sanctuaries and concert halls, was both a blessing and a weight. With every ovation, Billy's reputation grew. With every handshake from a gospel elder, his sense of responsibility deepened. He also caught the attention of Nat King Cole, one of the most polished and beloved entertainers of the era. Cole didn't just admire Billy, he encouraged him, mentored him, gently nudging him to think beyond gospel, to see how wide the world of music could be. For a boy raised in the church, this was both thrilling and confusing. Faith was the foundation of his identity, but jazz, blues, and the emerging sounds of rock and roll whispered to his spirit with equal force. As his teenage years unfolded, that tension between the sacred and the secular grew sharper. Gospel gave him grounding, but the allure of new rhythms and broader stages tugged at his imagination. Music was evolving, and Billy was evolving too. His organ playing became a synthesis of all these influences deeply rooted in gospel's power, but infused with the adventurous spirit of jazz improvisation and the raw energy of rock. For audiences, his performances felt like more than entertainment. They felt like revelation. Whether he was in a packed church, filling the air with spirit and fire, or in a smoky club where new sounds collided nightly, Billy didn't just accompany singers, he elevated them. His notes wrapped around voices, lifting them, amplifying their emotion. His playing had the power to stir hearts and shift atmospheres. Yet with each triumph, the contradictions grew. Surrounded by adults, pushed constantly to perform, Billy often felt isolated. He was praised as a prodigy but treated like a professional. Behind the wide smile that audiences adored was a boy trying to make sense of his place in the world. Was he still a child, or already a man? Was he an entertainer, or a vessel of something divine? By the middle of his teens, Billy Preston had already achieved more than most musicians do in a lifetime. He had played with gospel royalty, captured television audiences, and earned the admiration of musical legends. But for Billy, this was only the beginning. What no one could yet see was the path these early years were carving, a path that would lead him onto the road with Little Richard, into the orbit of the Beatles, and eventually into the history books, though not always with the recognition he deserved. For now, he was still the church boy from Los Angeles with magic in his hands, caught between faith and fame, between childhood and destiny. By the time most teenagers were navigating the halls of high school, Billy Preston was navigating the stages of the world. His life took a dramatic turn at just 16 when he was invited to join Little Richard's band as a touring keyboardist. For a boy who had spent his childhood torn between gospel roots and the temptations of broader music, this was a baptism by fire into the heart of rock and roll. It was 1962. Little Richard's band was not just any act, it was a storm. A rocket ship blasting through nightclubs with pure, unapologetic energy. The performances combined gospel fire, rock rebellion, and an unspoken queerness that most audiences at the time didn't even have language to describe. Billy was thrown straight into the chaos, but he wasn't overwhelmed. He became the engine under the hood, the steady groove driving the madness forward. Touring with Little Richard exposed him to the wider world in ways no classroom ever could. In Europe, especially in the clubs of Hamburg's Reeperbahn district, Billy witnessed firsthand the magnetic pull of Black American music on white audiences. He saw how gospel rhythms, blues inflections, and rock's raw pulse could cut through cultural barriers and ignite crowds. For the first time, he realized his music wasn't just powerful at home, it was universal. On that same tour, fate introduced him to four mop-topped lads from Liverpool who were then just an opening act, the Beatles. No one could have guessed at the time that this encounter would alter the trajectory of music history. But those first connections, forged in smoky clubs and chaotic nights, planted seeds that would bloom years later in ways Billy could never have imagined. Meanwhile, his own artistry was expanding. Collaborating with Sam Cooke deepened Billy's vision of what music could be. Cooke's velvet voice, his ability to carry gospel spirit into mainstream pop without losing authenticity, offered Billy a template. Sam wasn't just a mentor, he was proof that it was possible to remain soulful while crossing over into mass appeal. For Billy, it was both inspiration and challenge, how to honor his church foundation while reaching wider audiences. In 1965, at only 19, Billy stepped forward as a solo artist with his debut album, The Most Exciting Organ Ever. It was a bold title, but fitting. The record was playful, confident, and entirely instrumental, a showcase of how the organ, in Billy's hands, could be as dynamic and expressive as any voice. The album didn't climb the charts, but it did something arguably more important. It made the industry take notice. Billy wasn't just a sideman or prodigy anymore. He was carving out his own lane. At this same time, another giant took him under wing, Ray Charles. Charles recognized in Billy something familiar, a musician who didn't just play notes, but felt them, lived them. Ray became a mentor, teaching Billy discipline in the studio and showing him how to make every note count. If Little Richard had taught him raw energy, Ray Charles refined that into precision. Together, they forged Billy's identity as both a soulful improviser and a professional artist. But even as doors opened, challenges remained. He was still so young, navigating an industry dominated by older men. Labels and promoters didn't quite know what to do with him. A black organist who fused gospel, jazz, rock, and even psychedelic flavors? He didn't fit neatly into categories, and the music business liked categories. Still, his charisma shone. On the television show Shindig, Billy became a regular presence. Audiences lit up at his contagious smile, his infectious energy, and the way he made even the most complex organ runs look effortless. The organ had long been considered a church instrument, but Billy reframed it for mainstream audiences, bringing gospel fire into living rooms across America. His performances were like sermons disguised as pop entertainment, spreading joy in a way few others could. This period, between the raw chaos of Little Richard's tours and the mega fame that would later come with the Beatles, was formative. Billy wasn't yet a household name, but he was building something perhaps more lasting, an identity as an artist who refused to be confined. His early albums may not have dominated the charts, but they were laboratories where gospel met jazz, soul met funk, and a young man figured out who he was in sound. There was also an emotional undercurrent shaping him. Raised in the church, Billy still felt the pull of faith even as he explored secular fame. Balancing spirituality with stardom was never easy, and that tension would remain with him throughout his career. Yet it was also what gave his music depth. His songs weren't just catchy, they carried weight, heart, and soul. By the late 1960 seconds, Billy Preston was no longer just a gifted prodigy. He was a name that musicians recognized, someone who could elevate a recording session simply by walking into the room. He had already worked with legends, cut his own records, and learned from the best. And yet, the breakout moment that would catapult him into superstardom still hadn't arrived. That moment was just around the corner. It would come with a phone call from George Harrison, a reunion with the Beatles, and the chance to not only witness history but to save it. Billy Preston, once the little boy perched at a Hammond organ in Los Angeles, was about to step onto the biggest stage of his life, and this time, the whole world would be listening. By the end of the 1960 seconds, Billy Preston had already spent a lifetime in music. He had toured with Little Richard, learned from Sam Cooke, sharpened his craft under Ray Charles, and carved out his own space with solo albums and television appearances. Musicians knew his name. They admired his touch, his groove, his smile. But the wider world still hadn't fully seen him. The breakthrough moment, the one that would etch his name into history, arrived in 1969. It started with a phone call from George Harrison. The Beatles were in the middle of their now famous Let It Be sessions, and tensions were high. Arguments between John, Paul, and George threatened to tear the group apart. Creativity was stifled, the atmosphere heavy. George, remembering the teenage prodigy he had once met in Hamburg, thought perhaps Billy could bring some fresh light into the room. When Billy walked into the studio, it was like sunlight breaking through a storm. His spirit was warm, his energy humble, and most importantly, his playing was joyful. He sat down at the Fender Rhodes electric piano, and within minutes the mood shifted. The intro he played for Get Back wasn't just notes, it was life. Suddenly, the band that had been fractured found itself laughing, smiling, jamming again. John Lennon, rarely one to heap casual praise, famously said, "It's like having a fifth Beatle in the room." That statement wasn't just flattery. Billy Preston was the only musician ever credited alongside the Beatles on a release. The Beatles with Billy Preston. Get Back soared to #1 on charts worldwide, not just as a Beatles song, but as a collaboration that proved the healing power of music. Billy wasn't just filling space in those sessions, he was reminding the Beatles of their joy. His gospel background, his deep musicality, brought them back to the essence of playing together. At a time when egos and exhaustion nearly consumed the band, Billy's presence was glue. For a moment, he gave the world's biggest group a chance to breathe again. That contribution reached its peak on the 30th of January 1969, when Billy joined John, Paul, George, and Ringo on the rooftop of Apple Corps headquarters. It was cold, the London wind whipping through their hair, but the music was electric. Standing beside them with his afro swaying, Billy's fingers danced across the keys as if he had always belonged there. The rooftop concert became the Beatles' final live performance, an immortal piece of rock history, and Billy was right there at the center. But the magic didn't stop with Let It Be. Billy's fingerprints can be heard on Abbey Road as well, most memorably on the swirling organ of I Want You, She's So Heavy. His style blended seamlessly with the Beatles' evolving sound, and each note carried his signature mix of gospel fire and soulful precision. George Harrison's bond with Billy deepened. After the Beatles split, Harrison leaned on him for his own landmark solo project, All Things Must Pass. Billy's organ parts wove through the record, giving it layers of spiritual warmth. Harrison never forgot Billy's role in stabilizing the Beatles and insisted on helping him land a record deal with Apple Records, the Beatles' own label. For Billy, this was a turning point. Signing with Apple placed him on the same platform as his famous friends. In 1969, he released That's the Way God Planned It, produced by Harrison himself. The title track was both a declaration and a prayer, a bold mix of gospel conviction and rock flair, where Preston's piano thundered as if leading a congregation. His voice, gritty and heartfelt, carried lyrics that testified to his faith while still resonating with mainstream audiences. The song became one of his signatures, a moment where Billy stood not just behind legends but in front of the world on his own terms. It was spiritual, fearless, and unfiltered Billy Preston. The momentum carried into 1971, when George Harrison organized the concert for Bangladesh, one of the first major charity concerts of its kind. Sharing the stage with Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Ravi Shankar, and more, Billy's performance of That's the Way God Planned It electrified the crowd. His voice soared, his piano thundered, and the audience responded with roaring applause. That night, Billy wasn't just another name on the lineup. He was a revelation. In these years, Billy Preston transcended labels. He wasn't only a gospel musician nor just a rock sideman. He was a unifier. He brought the church into the club, the sacred into the secular, joy into spaces that had grown weary. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the biggest names of his time and proved he wasn't there to support, he was there to shine. Yet even in this breakthrough, the seeds of struggle were present. While the world saw a smiling, exuberant figure with the Beatles and Harrison, inside Billy was still wrestling with the same contradictions that had haunted him since childhood: faith versus fame, identity versus expectation, joy on stage versus loneliness off it. Still, for a brief and shining moment, Billy Preston wasn't just the fifth Beatle. He was a star in his own right, radiating light that reached across genres and generations. His Apple Records era showed the world a man who could elevate giants and still speak with his own unmistakable voice. And soon, the 1,970 seconds would take him even further into #1 singles, Grammy wins, and household recognition. For now, though, Billy had carved out his place in rock history, not as a footnote, but as a force. The Beatles had broken up, the cultural tide was shifting, and Billy Preston stood at a crossroads. For years, he had been the trusted sideman, the prodigy, the session player, the joyful spirit who breathed life into others' songs. But now, in the early 1,970 seconds, it was finally his turn to stand alone. No longer the little boy at the Hammond organ, no longer just the fifth Beatle, Billy was ready to claim his own stage. His breakthrough as a solo star came with a sound that seemed to come from outer space, literally. In 1971, Billy released Outta Space, a funky instrumental built on his signature clavinet riff. The track was electric, a cosmic jam that combined gospel roots with futuristic grooves. Radio stations picked it up, clubs spun it, and audiences couldn't get enough of its joyful energy. In 1973, Outta Space earned him a Grammy Award for Best Pop Instrumental Performance. Suddenly, Billy Preston was no longer just the best-kept secret among musicians. He was a star in his own right, and he wasn't done. In 1973, he followed with Will It Go Round in Circles, a song bursting with humor, groove, and existential charm. The track asked playful questions about life's patterns while locking listeners into an irresistible beat. It shot straight to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, cementing Billy as more than just a brilliant player. He was a hitmaker. His charisma poured through the record, his voice carrying the same warmth and fire that had always lived in his playing. Next came Space Race, another instrumental that rode the wave of funk's popularity and even became the theme song for American Bandstand throughout much of the 1,970 seconds. Billy's fingerprints were everywhere on radio, on television, on dance floors across the country. He had brought the organ and clavinet, instruments often confined to gospel and jazz, into the heart of mainstream pop culture. But perhaps his most iconic solo statement arrived in 1974 with Nothing from Nothing. Driven by a jaunty piano hook and a message about self-worth and reciprocity, the song radiated positivity. Audiences connected instantly. It soared to #1 on the Billboard charts, solidifying Billy's status as a household name. For a man who had spent his childhood overshadowed by gospel elders and his youth backing rock legends, this was vindication. Billy Preston wasn't just part of someone else's story, he was the story. His live performances during this period were unforgettable. On Soul Train, on the Midnight Special, and on national tours, Billy's energy filled every room. His giant afro, bright smile, and animated stage presence made him impossible to ignore. He could slide seamlessly from a soulful ballad to a funky jam, from a gospel-inspired piano run to a psychedelic clavinet groove. He was playful, spiritual, and electrifying all at once. Crowds adored him, and his peers respected him even more. His albums from the mid-1970 seconds reflected his refusal to be boxed in. Everybody Likes Some Kind of Music lived up to its title, jumping between genres with ease. The Kids and Me blended social commentary with funk rhythms. It's My Pleasure showcased his love of experimentation with synthesizers, pointing toward the future of soul and R&B. Billy refused to stay in one lane. He could praise the Lord on one track and launch into cosmic funk on the next, and somehow it all made sense because it was all authentically him. Collaboration also remained a central part of his rise. Quincy Jones sought him out. Sly and the Family Stone vibed with his fearless creativity. The Rolling Stones invited him to bring his magic to their records and tours. Everyone wanted a piece of Billy Preston's energy because he had the rare gift of making every song better. His organ, his clavinet, his very presence elevated music, no matter the genre. He even made a splash on the big screen. In 1978, he appeared alongside the Bee Gees and Peter Frampton in Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a rock musical film. While the movie itself received mixed reviews, Billy's reprisal of Get Back reminded audiences of the role he had played in the Beatles story and showed that his star power translated beyond records and concerts. Yet beneath the glitter and groove, cracks were beginning to show. The very fame he had longed for brought new pressures. The demand to keep delivering hits, the constant need to smile, to dazzle, to balance sacred faith with secular stardom. Billy was still that church boy at heart, the prodigy who felt closest to God when his fingers touched the keys. But now, he was also a pop icon navigating an industry that often cared more about charts than about souls. For the time being, though, Billy Preston was flying high. He had proven himself not only as a brilliant accompanist, but as a force all his own. He wasn't just with the Beatles anymore. He wasn't just a guest in someone else's spotlight. For a brief but brilliant window in the 1970 seconds, Billy Preston stood at center stage, funky, fearless, and free. At the height of his solo fame, Billy Preston seemed unstoppable. He had #1 hits, sold-out shows, and collaborations with the biggest names in music. To the world, he was the smiling figure with the giant afro, dazzling crowds with funk grooves and gospel fire. But behind that smile was a man carrying battles that few ever saw. For all his charisma on stage, Billy struggled deeply with identity. He was a black man raised in the church, a child of gospel traditions, now working in predominantly white music spaces. He was an artist whose foundation was faith, but whose fame depended on navigating the secular world of pop and funk. That tension never left him. At every turn, he felt the weight of expectations too spiritual for the mainstream, too secular for the church, too complex for an industry that wanted neat labels. And layered over those struggles was another reality, one he could never speak aloud in his lifetime. Though he never publicly came out, many close to him acknowledged later that Billy was a gay man living in an era when such truth could cost him everything. In the gospel world he came from, homosexuality was condemned. In the mainstream music industry, queerness was still taboo, a dangerous liability. So Billy carried the secret silently, pushing it down beneath layers of humor, charm, and relentless work. That silence came at a cost. The isolation of living with such a hidden burden gnawed at him. He could light up an audience of thousands, but walk off stage to crushing loneliness. His music carried joy, but off stage, the weight of repression hung heavy. He longed for authenticity, but the world around him made it impossible. In that gap between the public image and the private pain, Billy sought refuge where too many artists before him had gone: substances. At first it was a way to cope, a way to quiet the contradictions and silence the voices of doubt. Cocaine, alcohol, prescription pills each promised temporary relief, an escape from the tension of being everything to everyone and still not being allowed to be himself. But what begins as relief can quickly become reliance. As the years wore on, Billy's dependency grew. The same hands that once moved effortlessly across keyboards began to tremble in private. The same energy that had once seemed inexhaustible now required more and more fuel just to keep up appearances. On stage, he still radiated joy. Off stage, he was chasing peace in powders, bottles, and pills. Even in the studio, where he had always found sanctuary, the cracks became harder to hide. The hits came less frequently. Sessions stretched longer. Stories began to circulate of erratic behavior, missed appointments, sudden outbursts. To those who loved him, these were warning signs. To an industry that valued consistency above all, they were excuses to look elsewhere. Yet Billy never stopped creating. He poured himself into music even as the weight grew heavier. His performances still carried brilliance, but they were shadowed by the knowledge that something inside him was unraveling. Fame, he once said, was like a drug in itself. It lifted you up, then dropped you hard when it no longer needed you. That truth cut especially deep for someone whose very identity was already so fragile, so hidden. As the 1,970 seconds gave way to the 1,980 seconds, the contradictions within Billy's life sharpened. The public saw the dazzling star, the Grammy winner, the joyful entertainer. Privately, he was a man wrestling with faith that sometimes felt distant, a sexuality that had to remain secret, and addictions that threatened to consume him. He had always been more than music. He had been a healer, a unifier, a bridge. But bridges, too, can collapse under too much weight. For Billy Preston, the conflict was no longer just about balancing gospel and funk, sacred and secular. It was about survival, holding on to the parts of himself that fame and fear hadn't already taken. The smile was still there, the music was still powerful, but behind the spotlight, his demons had already begun to carve deep scars. By the time the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds arrived, Billy Preston's once bright star had dimmed in the eyes of the mainstream industry. The man who had lifted the Beatles during their darkest hours, who had climbed to the top of the Billboard charts, who had carried gospel fire into funk and pop, was now fading from marquees and festival posters. And the reasons were as complex as they were cruel. The music business was changing. Synthesizers, glossy pop stars, and image-driven marketing dominated the era. Labels wanted artists who fit neatly into a package, who could be sold as brands as much as musicians. Billy Preston, explosive, versatile, complicated, didn't fit the mold. He wasn't just a soul singer, not just a funk player, not just a gospel artist. He was all of them at once. And in an industry obsessed with categories, that made him difficult to market. But the deeper truth was uglier. Billy was black, queer, and outspoken in his music. Where white rockers with troubled pasts were forgiven, even celebrated, Billy's missteps were weaponized against him. His history of substance abuse, his erratic behavior in the studio, and his personal struggles became reasons to push him aside. Racism in the industry meant that his brilliance was often overshadowed by his mistakes, magnified in ways his white peers never had to endure. Even his contributions were often undervalued. Despite playing on landmark recordings, Billy rarely received the producer credits or songwriting royalties that could have secured his financial future. More often than not, he walked away from sessions with only a flat fee and a handshake, while others profited off the songs he had helped bring to life. The system had extracted his talent, then left him behind. As the years wore on, legal troubles added to his burden, arrests tied to drugs, parole violations, and eventually a prison sentence in the late 1,990 seconds painted a stark picture of decline. For many fans, the man who once danced joyfully on Soul Train seemed unrecognizable. Headlines focused on his troubles rather than his music, reducing his legacy to mugshots and scandals. And yet, even in prison, Billy's soul refused to stay silent. Behind bars, he reportedly taught other inmates how to play piano. He prayed. He sang. He returned, once again, to the faith that had carried him as a child prodigy at the Hammond organ. Music had always been his refuge, and even in exile, it remained his anchor. Still, the weight of being forgotten was heavy. Billy had given the industry his soul, and it had discarded him when he no longer fit its narrative. He had watched the same business that had cheered his rise turn its back on him in his struggles. Fame, as he once said, was like a drug. It lifted you up, then dropped you hard when it no longer needed you. Nowhere was that truth clearer than in the silence that surrounded him in these years. Despite it all, Billy never stopped creating. He continued contributing to albums by artists like Eric Clapton and even the Red Hot Chili Peppers. He toured with Ringo Starr's all-star band, a reminder of the bond he still carried with the Beatles family. His playing, raw and radiant, could still light up any song he touched. But the spotlight rarely followed him. He existed in the margins, respected by musicians, forgotten by the mainstream. By the early 2000s, Billy had returned more fully to gospel, seeking comfort in the music that had first embraced him. On stage, his joy was still evident. Behind the keys, his fingers still spoke with the same fire that had once stunned audiences around the world. But the industry at large had already turned the page, moving on without him. Billy Preston's conflict was no longer about chart positions or Grammy wins. It was about dignity, holding on to the truth of who he was in a business that had chewed him up and spit him out. He had been too talented, too versatile, too uncontainable, and for that, the system punished him. The irony was bitter. The man who had once been the heartbeat of history now lived in relative obscurity, remembered more for his troubles than for the genius that had changed music forever. But Billy, even in exile, never let bitterness fully consume him. He clung to his faith. He clung to the keys. He clung to the one thing the industry couldn't take away: his music. When Billy Preston passed away in 2006, the world did not stop. There were no massive televised tributes, no wall-to-wall coverage of his final days, no Grammy segment dedicated solely to him. For many, his death passed quietly, almost like a footnote. But for those who understood what he had given music, the loss was immeasurable. Billy's legacy isn't always loud, but it is everywhere. You might not always hear his name, but you have heard him. Every time Get Back comes on the radio and those bright keyboard lines sparkle through the track, that is Billy. Every time a gospel-infused organ riff sneaks its way into a funk or pop song, that is his fingerprint. His playing, his spirit, his style, it all still pulses through decades of sound. George Harrison once said Billy was the only person who could have saved the Beatles. That wasn't exaggeration. During the Let It Be sessions, when the band was fracturing under the weight of egos and exhaustion, it was Billy's joyful energy that brought them back together, if only for a while. He wasn't just a session player, he was glue, a healer through sound. And though history often tells the Beatles' story without him, the truth is that his presence changed the course of their ending. Billy's influence extended far beyond that one moment. His music helped shape funk, gospel rock, and crossover R&B in ways that paved the road for future artists. Long before Prince blurred the lines between the sacred and the sensual, Billy had already brought gospel conviction to funky grooves. Long before hip-hop sampled organ and clavinet riffs to add grit and soul, Billy had already shown how those sounds could elevate mainstream hits. Songs like Outta Space and Will It Go Round in Circles weren't just commercial successes, they were declarations. They said, "I am more than a sideman. I am the music." And the industry listened, if only briefly. Billy's funk anthems and spiritual ballads laid a blueprint that others would build on. His versatility, once seen as too complicated to market, has since become the very quality celebrated in modern musicians. Those who played with him never forgot his brilliance. Eric Clapton called him the best organ player he had ever known. Sly Stone admired his ability to merge styles without losing authenticity. And George Harrison remained one of his staunchest supporters until the end, ensuring that Billy's name was not erased from the record of their collaborations. In the years after his death, Billy's sound has continued to circulate in unexpected ways. Hip-hop producers sampled his grooves. Young musicians covered his songs, often discovering in him a genius they had never been taught about. YouTube clips of his performances resurfaced, showing new generations the sight of a man who could make a Hammond organ sing like a choir. Even on platforms like TikTok, snippets of his funky riffs found new life, proving that music this powerful never really dies. For a long time, the mainstream industry overlooked him, but recognition eventually arrived, even if it was late. In 2021, Billy Preston was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was an overdue honor, one that affirmed what musicians had always known. Billy wasn't just a contributor. He was a creator, a cornerstone, a legend. The applause may have come years too late, but the validation still mattered. His story is also a lesson about how the industry treats artists who don't fit its narrow molds. Billy was black, gospel-rooted, queer, and versatile to a fault. These qualities made him unique, but they also made him difficult for a system that valued easy narratives. And so he was celebrated when convenient, discarded when complicated. That tension between brilliance and recognition shaped his life and makes his legacy even more important to honor. Because Billy Preston showed the world what music could do when it came from a place of truth. His joy on stage wasn't an act, it was the overflow of a spirit that had been playing since age 3. His solos weren't technical displays, they were sermons, prayers, conversations with something greater. He wasn't simply playing for fame or fortune. He was playing because music was the only place he could fully be himself. Today, his name may still not sit alongside the legends he supported: Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, Starr, Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, but his influence is etched into their music, and through them, into culture itself. The Beatles needed him, funk needed him, gospel needed him, and in the end, so do we. Billy Preston's legacy is proof that greatness doesn't always come with the spotlight. Sometimes it whispers, hidden beneath layers of history, waiting for those willing to listen. And when you do listen, when you really hear those organ swells, those funky clavinet riffs, you realize that Billy Preston was never a footnote. He was the heartbeat, the bridge, the truth. And that is what endures. They called him the fifth Beatle, but that was never the whole story. Billy Preston was far more than a guest in someone else's spotlight. He was a prodigy who turned the Hammond organ into a vessel of fire, a bridge between gospel and rock. A man whose playing lifted legends and carried songs into immortality. And yet, history too often reduced him to a footnote. His life was a paradox of staggering highs and devastating lows. He stood on rooftops with the Beatles, won Grammys, topped charts with his own Hasson hits. He made audiences dance, pray, and believe all in the same set. But he also endured crushing loneliness, silenced truths, addiction, and an industry that turned its back when he no longer fit its narrative. Billy's brilliance was undeniable, but recognition was inconsistent, fleeting, and often denied. And so his story leaves us with a question. Why do we celebrate the stars he supported while forgetting the man who gave them their spark? Why do we let the industry decide whose genius is remembered and whose is overlooked? Billy Preston may not have received the grand tributes he deserved, but the music tells the truth. It always has. Every joyful riff, every soaring chord, every funk groove that still gets sampled today is proof of who he was. His legacy lives in sound, in spirit, in the countless artists and listeners who still feel his fingerprints even if they don't always know his name. We owe Billy Preston more than silence. We owe him remembrance, recognition, and above all, our ears truly listening to the music he left behind. Because in the end, his genius was not in fame, but in feeling. And that is something the world can never erase. Billy Preston's name may have been dimmed by history, but in the hearts of those who listen, his light still burns.